Galactic Council refused humanity's offer. Now they beg for mercy. The ship shook before I even reached the briefing room. Not from weapons fire. Not from anything so dramatic. It shook because we had just dropped out of the Council's transit corridor without permission, and their automated defense buoys were already pinging us with warning signals strong enough to rattle the hull plating. Commander Nora Gill was already at my side, pulling up the translation feed on her wrist display, her jaw tight. "They're telling us to hold position," she said. "I know," I said. "Keep moving." My name is Sable Rin. At the time, I held the rank of Senior Envoy for the United Earth Diplomatic Corps, which was a title that sounded far more impressive than it felt in that moment, standing in a corridor that smelled like recycled air and cold metal, heading toward a meeting that no human being had ever attended before. The Galactic Council's Grand Hall of Concord was built around a gas giant called Orith, a slow-spinning giant of amber and brown at the edge of what they called the Inner Veil. 7 species had constructed the station together over 4 centuries. It was enormous. It was beautiful. And when our small diplomatic shuttle finally docked in the outer ring and the airlock hissed open, the first thing I noticed was that no one had come to greet us. There was a docking attendant, a small creature with 6 thin arms and pale blue skin, who handed Nora a physical chip with our meeting coordinates without looking at either of us. That was it. No reception. No escort. Just a chip and a corridor and the distant sound of something that might have been music or might have been machinery. With alien architecture, it was sometimes hard to tell. Nora looked at the chip, then at me. They could have at least sent someone to walk us in. "They don't think we're worth the effort," I said, and I started walking. What I need you to understand, before I tell you what happened in that chamber, is where Earth stood at that moment in history. 40 years before, we had nearly ended ourselves. The Unification War had started as a political argument between 2 blocks of nations and grown into something that left entire coastlines dark and quiet for years. When it was over, the survivors did not celebrate. They simply looked at what remained and made a decision, quietly and without much ceremony, that it would never happen again. What followed was not peace exactly. It was something more like a controlled, desperate sprint. Every resource, every mind, every spare hour was pointed in the same direction, outward. We had found the crashed survey drone 12 years after the war ended, buried in a glacier in Greenland, clearly not from Earth, clearly not from anything we had ever built. The science teams worked on it for 11 years before they understood enough to build anything from it. And then they built very quietly and very quickly, and they did not tell the rest of the galaxy. By the time I walked into the Grand Hall of Concord, Earth had 2 working starships, a prototype relay communicator, and a folder full of proposals that we believed, genuinely believed, would benefit every species in this part of the galaxy. The Grand Hall itself took my breath away despite everything. It was a sphere, roughly 300 meters across, with tiered observation platforms carved from some dark stone I did not recognize. At the center was a circular platform, suspended in the air by what I assumed were magnetic fields, where 7 chairs sat arranged in an inward-facing arc. 7 species, 7 seats, 7 sets of eyes watching our shuttle crew and our small delegation walk in from the eastern entrance. I had studied all of them. The Kethna were insectoid, with wide flat heads and compound eyes that caught light strangely. The Drell were tall and thin, gray-skinned, almost featureless at this distance. The Sewer were the ones that looked most unsettling to human eyes, because they moved in ways that suggested their joints were in different places than you expected. The remaining 4 species I knew less well. Their names were on the briefing documents, but their personalities were not. And then there was Ambassador Veyrak. He was the Drell head delegate, and he sat in the center chair with the particular stillness of someone who had been very powerful for a very long time and had stopped needing to perform it. He had 4 eyes, arranged in 2 horizontal pairs, and all 4 were fixed on me as I crossed the platform floor. I did not look away. Nora moved slightly behind me. Our technical aide, a quiet young man named Colin Price, carried the proposal folder in both hands. The other 3 members of our delegation spread out behind me in the formation we had practiced. I reached the designated speaking circle, a ring marked in the floor, and I stopped. Varek spoke first. His translator rendered it into flat, clean English. "You are the human delegation." "I am," I said. "Senior Envoy Sable Wren, representing the United Earth Diplomatic Corps and the Joint Nations of Humanity. We are grateful for the opportunity to address the Council." "You were not given an opportunity," Varek said. "You requested one through 17 separate diplomatic channels over 9 months. The Council agreed to receive you as a courtesy." "Then I am grateful for the courtesy," I said. There was a sound from one of the other delegates. A short, rhythmic sound that Colin later confirmed, after checking the translation log, was laughter. I did not react. Varek tilted his head slightly. "Earth is a Class D world by Council classification, pre-spaceflight, limited technological development, non-member, non-partner, non-aligned. You have no standing in this hall beyond what the Council chooses to extend." "Our survey data may be outdated," I said carefully. "We are here today, which suggests some things may have changed." Another short sound from the room. This time I was not sure it was laughter. I opened the proposal. I spoke for 40 minutes. I had practiced it for 4 months. I explained, clearly and without overstating anything, that Earth had developed faster-than-light travel without using the Council's relay gates. I explained that we had mapped 83 star systems in our region and found resources that the Council's records listed as unexplored. I explained that our propulsion design used a method that, as far as our scientists could determine, was entirely different from anything the Council currently employed, and that we were willing to share the foundational research in exchange for full partnership status, access to the relay network, and a formal alliance framework. I watched their faces while I spoke. Most of them showed nothing. The sewer delegate was very still. The Kethna delegate, second from the left, watched me with a focus that felt different from the others, not contempt, something closer to calculation. When I finished, Varek was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "The Council will deliberate." The deliberation took 4 minutes. I know because Nora was timing it. Varek spoke the result in a voice that was entirely flat. "The Council declines the human proposal in full. Earth's claims regarding independent faster-than-light development are not credible based on available intelligence. The resource mapping you have presented overlaps with regions already under Council Survey Charter. Your proposed alliance framework offers nothing the Council requires. The delegation is thanked for its time and is free to depart." Colin made a small sound beside me. I put my hand out slightly, and he went quiet. I looked at Varek for a long moment. Then I looked at the Kethna delegate, the one who had watched me differently, and in the half-second before the vote was called and recorded I saw it. Just the smallest hesitation, not enough to change anything, but enough to tell me something. Not everyone in that room was certain they had made the right choice. I gathered the proposal folder from Colin. I thanked the Council, clearly and without sarcasm, for their time. I turned and walked back to the eastern entrance with my delegation. We did not run. We did not hurry. We walked at exactly the pace we had walked in. It was only when the airlock sealed behind us and the docking attendant was gone, and it was just the 6 of us in the shuttle corridor, that Nora let out a long breath. "That was humiliating," she said. "Yes," I agreed. "What do we do?" I looked out the small porthole at the vast amber curve of Orth below us, and beyond it, the stars, and beyond those stars, 83 unmapped systems full of everything we needed. "We go home," I said, "and we get to work." I opened my journal that night in the bunk of the shuttle, and I wrote 3 words. "Fine, we'll do it alone." I did not know then how long it would take. I did not know what it would cost. I did not know that 30 years later I would be sitting in a much larger ship, watching a very different kind of delegation come to find me, and that the folder I had carried into that hall would be sitting in a glass case in the entrance of the Terran Sovereignty Command building on the 3rd floor, labeled simply as a historical artifact. I just knew that they had made a mistake. And humanity, when it decides something with that particular quiet certainty, does not forget. The signal came in at 3:40 ship time. I had been awake for 2 hours already, which was not unusual. Sleep had always come to me in pieces, never in one clean block, and I had long since stopped pretending otherwise. I was in my ready room aboard the carrier ship Endurance, reading maintenance projections for the 3rd Fleet's drive systems, when the duty officer's voice came through the comm panel. Admiral Rin, priority transmission from Relay Station 9, marked Council Origin, authenticated. I set down the projections, put it through. The translation came in audio only, no visual, which meant whoever had sent it was either moving fast or deliberately avoiding identification. The voice was drell, formal, stripped of the usual ceremonial padding that Council communications included at the start. Whoever this was, they had gone straight to the point. Terran Sovereignty Command. This is an emergency notification under Council Accord 7, Article 12. The species-designated Vreth have engaged and destroyed Council Fleet Array Gamma at the Ren Corridor. Estimated casualties exceed 80,000 personnel across 6 member worlds. We are requesting all available information on the Vreth from any non-Council monitoring entities in the Outer Veil region. Please respond. The message ended. I sat for a moment in the quiet of my ready room, with the low hum of the ship around me, and I thought about the word requesting. In 30 years of watching Council communications come and go through our intelligence channels, I had never once heard that word directed at a non-member entity. The Council did not request. It declared, notified, directed, and occasionally warned. It did not ask. Something very bad had happened to them. I pressed the comm, "Get me Commander Price." Colin Price was 53 now, grayer than I remembered from the shuttle corridor 30 years ago, and sharper in ways that only came from 3 decades of intelligence work. He arrived in my ready room in 4 minutes, which meant he had also been awake. He looked at the transmission log on my display and said nothing for a moment. "Gamma Array," he said finally. "That's their strongest combined formation in the Ren sector, 300 warships." "Gone," I said. "Gone," he agreed. I leaned back in my chair. "Pull the Vreth file, everything we have." He already had it on his own display. Of course he did. Colin Price did not walk into a room without knowing what was in it. The Vreth file was 12 years old and marked at the highest classification level in the Terran Sovereignty System. It had exactly 47 people cleared to read it. Those 47 people had signed agreements so thorough that the legal team had once described them, with a straight face, as binding across all known jurisdictions including hypothetical ones. What the file described was this. 12 years ago, a Terran deep survey vessel named Crossfield had been mapping a region of space approximately 200 light-years beyond the outer veil when it detected an anomalous formation. 14 ships, configuration unknown, moving in a pattern that suggested coordination rather than drift. Captain Oliver Drake, a calm and methodical man from the northwest of England who had been exploring deep space for 20 years, had held position and observed for 11 hours before making any move. What he observed was a Vreth formation moving toward the inner veil at a speed that should have been impossible for the drive technology the Council's intelligence logs described them as having. They had improved significantly, and they were not doing a survey. They were moving with the deliberate pattern of something that had already decided where it was going. Drake had reported this to Terran Command. Terran Command had relayed it up the chain, And at the very top of that chain, in a meeting I had attended personally, the decision had been made not to inform the council. The reasoning was not simple, and I have turned it over in my mind many times since. Part of it was practical. The council did not acknowledge us as a partner, so passing them intelligence would mean initiating contact on unequal terms and handing them something valuable for nothing in return. Part of it was strategic. We were still building. Every year we did not announce ourselves was another year of shipyards and research and quiet expansion. And part of it, if I am being honest, was the memory of a man with 4 eyes telling me, in a flat translated voice, that Earth's claims were not credible. We had intercepted the Vreth formation, not all 14 ships, 8 of them. We had let 6 continue and tracked them until they turned back toward the outer veil, apparently concluding their survey. Then we had done something very careful with the record and continued building. Now I sat with that decision in my hands again, and the council was using the word requesting. Colin was watching me. "How long have we known the Vreth were moving?" I said. "Our latest intercepts suggest they began the Ren corridor approach 11 weeks ago," he said. "We flagged it. The assessment was that they were targeting council fringe positions first, testing response capability." And the assessment of council response capability. He paused. Poor. I nodded slowly. "What is our current fleet strength in this sector?" 41 warships at Relay Station 9. The second fleet is 3 days out at standard travel. If you call in the outer patrol groups, we can have 180 combat-capable ships within 6 days. I thought about that. 180 ships. 30 years ago, Earth had 2. What about the Vreth formation that took out Gamma Ray? Based on the signal debris pattern in the transmission, our analysts think it was a core strike group, maybe 80 to 100 units, which means they have much more behind it. I stood up and walked to the porthole. The stars outside were very still, the way they always were, indifferent and constant. "The council asked for information," I said. "Yes." "They did not ask for help." "No," Colin said, "not yet." I turned around. "Then we wait for them to ask correctly." He looked at me steadily. There was a question behind his eyes that he did not ask out loud, because Colin Price had been working with me long enough to know when I had already thought through the thing he was about to raise. But he said it anyway, carefully. "People are dying out there. Council species, yes, but people." "I know. And the Vreth will not stop at council space." "I know that too. So the waiting is not because you don't care." "The waiting," I said, "is because when we move on our terms, not theirs, not out of obligation to people who looked us in the face and told us our claims were not credible." I held his gaze. "When they ask, Colin, they ask properly, and then we show them what 30 years of building looks like." He was quiet for a moment. Then he nodded just once and looked back at his display. "Gamma Array's last telemetry is coming through the secondary relay now," he said. "Do you want to see it?" "Yes," I said. "Show me everything." The footage was grainy, signal degraded, 20 seconds of data captured by an automated buoy before it went dark. But it was enough to see the Vreth formation moving through the Ren corridor, and enough to understand why 300 council warships had not been enough. The Vreth did not fight the way the council fought. The council's military doctrine, from everything we had ever been able to study of it, was built around formation integrity, coordinated energy volleys, and defensive screening. It was a doctrine built by species who had spent centuries fighting each other and had eventually developed a shared set of rules about how battles worked. The Vreth had not been part of those centuries. They did not fight with rules. They moved in fluid, shifting patterns that broke apart and reformed faster than formation doctrine could account for. They hit from angles that should have been covered and were not. They were not smarter than the Council's commanders. They were simply entirely different, and the Council's commanders had never trained for entirely different. I had. Every Terran military academy in the past 20 years had a required course called Adaptive Combat Theory. The core principle was simple. Do not assume your enemy will fight the way you expect them to. Assume nothing. Observe, adapt, improvise, and survive. It was a principle that had come, in a roundabout way, from humanity's own long and difficult history of fighting itself in every possible configuration and terrain. We had trained for entirely different because we had once been entirely different from each other. I watched the 20 seconds of footage 3 times. Then I set it aside and went back to the maintenance projections for the Third Fleet, because there was nothing to do yet but wait and be ready. But my junior tactical officer, a 26-year-old named Alice Ford who had graduated top of her class and had a habit of asking the exact question you did not want to answer, knocked on the ready room door at 6:30 and came in with a data pad and an expression that suggested she had been awake even longer than I had. "Admiral," she said, "the Council has lost contact with 2 more fringe positions overnight. The Vreth are moving faster than the initial assessment." I looked at her. "Should we begin pre-deployment preparation?" she asked. Then she looked at me with eyes that were steady and clear and asked the thing underneath the question. "Admiral, are we going to help them?" I looked out the porthole again. The stars. The same stars that had been there when I walked out of a hall 30 years ago with a folder under my arm and 3 words in my journal. "Yes," I said quietly, "but not yet." Alice Ford nodded and turned to go. "Ford," I said. She stopped. "Make sure the Second Fleet increases to maximum travel speed. 6 days is too long." She almost smiled. "Yes, Admiral." She left, and I sat alone with the hum of the ship and the weight of timing and the absolute certainty, deep in my chest, that the next message from the Council would sound nothing like a notification. It would sound like something I had never heard from them before. It would sound like "please." The ship that came to find us was not a warship. That was the first thing I noticed when the proximity alert sounded and the duty officer pulled it up on the main display. It was a Council diplomatic vessel, mid-range, the kind used for high-level delegation transport. No weapons signature, no escort. Just one ship, moving through the outer edge of Terran sovereignty space without a filed transit request, broadcasting a Council diplomatic frequency on every channel loud enough that our relay stations at the border had been picking it up for 6 hours before it reached us. They were not trying to sneak in. They were announcing themselves. They wanted to be found. Colin Price stood beside me at the display and said nothing for a while. "One ship," I said. "One ship," he agreed. "No escort, no fleet presence, a diplomatic vessel." "Their fleet presence in this sector is limited," he said carefully. "The Vreth have pushed them back from 3 of their forward positions in the last 8 days." I looked at the ship on the display. Sleek by Council standards, longer than our diplomatic runners, with the characteristic curved hull architecture of Drell design, which meant this was not a General Council delegation. This was a Drell delegation, which almost certainly meant one specific person. "Get me the roster on that ship," I said. Colin had it in 40 seconds. The lead name on the delegation manifest was Ambassador Veyrak. I had not seen that name in 30 years. I had thought about it, occasionally, in the quiet way you think about people who have made a significant impression on you without meaning to. Not with anger, exactly. More the way you think about a locked door that you know, eventually, you will get to open. I straightened my uniform jacket and said, "Bring them in." We gave them Bay 14. Not the main diplomatic bay, which was larger and had better lighting, and was where we received the delegations of our own allied worlds. Bay 14 was clean and functional and perfectly adequate, and it was located in the midsection of the Endurance, which meant the delegation would have to walk through 2 long corridors and pass 3 observation windows looking out over our shipyard formation before they reached the conference room. I did not arrange that by accident. Nora Gill, who was now my chief of staff and who had been with me through most of the 30 years in between, met me at the conference room door with a look that was caught between professional composure and something that might, in a different setting, have been satisfaction. His ship took hull damage on approach, she said quietly. A Vreth raider clipped them near the outer relay. They've been patched, but they're not traveling well. I absorbed that. Was anyone hurt? Some of his delegation, minor injuries. Their ship's medical team handled it. I nodded. Make sure they know we have medical staff available if they need it. Nora looked at me for a moment. That's generous. It's decent, I said. There's a difference. The conference room was plain. A table, chairs, a display panel on the far wall currently showing nothing. I had chosen it specifically because it did not look like a command center. It looked like a room where two groups of people sat down and talked. I wanted Veyrak, when he walked in, to feel the size of the ship around him without me having to point it out. He walked in with 5 members of his delegation, and he looked different. 30 years had changed both of us. I had gray in my hair and lines at the corners of my eyes, and the particular posture of someone who had spent 3 decades making decisions under weight. Veyrak looked older in a way that was harder to define. The formal council robes were gone. He wore a plain diplomatic uniform, gray, with the council emblem on the left shoulder. Without the robes, he was thinner than I remembered. Smaller. Not smaller in a diminished sense. Smaller in the way things look when you see them outside of the setting that gave them scale. He looked at me for a long moment. Then he looked at the table and he sat down. His delegation sat behind him, quiet. I sat across from him. Nora and Colin took their places at my sides. I said nothing. I had decided on the walk down to the conference room that I would let him begin. He said, "You have grown your fleet significantly." 30 years is a long time, I said. We underestimated your rate of development. Yes, I said, you did. He was quiet for a moment. Outside the window behind him, one of our cruisers was running a departure sequence, its drive signature lighting up briefly before it moved off toward the outer marker. I watched his eyes track it without moving his head. The Vreth, he said. Yes. They have destroyed or disabled 14 Council military formations in the past 6 weeks. They have taken 3 inhabited fringe worlds. Evacuation was partial. He paused. Casualties are significant. I kept my expression steady. I am aware of the situation. He looked at me then with something I had not expected from him. Not contempt. Not the careful diplomatic blankness that had been his whole manner 30 years ago. Something that looked, if I was reading alien expressions correctly, like the face of someone who had spent a long time not being afraid and had recently discovered what that was. The Council, he said, is requesting Terran military assistance. There it was. I did not move. I did not smile. I did not let anything show on my face that I had not chosen to put there. I said, I would like you to clarify something for me. When you say requesting, do you mean the Council is asking for help or notifying us of a requirement? He was still for a beat. Asking, he said. Formally. Formally. I reached across the table. Colin had placed a single document there and I slid it toward Veyrak. He looked at it. It was a copy of the proposal I had brought to the Grand Hall of Concord 30 years ago. The original. Digitally preserved, with the original timestamp and my signature at the bottom and the seal of the United Earth Diplomatic Corps in the corner. He looked at it for a long moment. I remember this document, he said quietly. I thought you might, I said. He looked up at me. The Council voted on this proposal, I said. 7 votes unanimous to decline. The deliberation lasted 4 minutes. I let that sit for a moment. I counted. Veyrak said nothing. We came to you with something real, I said. We were honest about what we had and what we were asking for. We were offering a partnership on equal terms, and we were told very efficiently that our claims were not credible and that we had nothing you required. The room was quiet. One of his delegation members shifted slightly. I did not look at them. I am not telling you this to punish you, I continued. I am telling you this because the terms of any assistance we provide need to be understood clearly by both sides, not as charity, not as a favor, as an agreement between equals. I placed a second document on the table. This one was new. Colin had helped me draft it over the past 4 days, after the first council transmission had arrived. A permanent Terran seat on the Galactic Council, I said. Full voting rights, equal to any current member. Unrestricted access to the Council's Relay Gate network. A formal technology-sharing framework reviewed and renegotiated every 10 years by mutual agreement. And reparations to the Kethna colonial settlements that were destroyed in the Vreth Advance, specifically the 3 worlds on their fringe boundary, from the Council Infrastructure Fund. He looked at the document. I let him look. Why the Kethna specifically? He said finally. Because they deserved better than they got, I said simply, from the Vreth and from the Council before that. He looked at me steadily. You are asking for a great deal. I am asking for what was fair 30 years ago, I said. The price has not increased. The circumstances have. Another silence. Outside, a second cruiser moved past the window, then a third. Veyrak tracked each one. You have 48 hours, I said. I suggest you use them well. The Vreth do not wait, and neither will we. He looked at me one more time. Whatever he saw in my face, I do not know. But he picked up both documents carefully, stood without ceremony, and walked to the door. At the threshold, he stopped. Ambassador Rin, he said. He did not use my military rank. He used the title I had carried into his hall 30 years ago, and I do not think that was an accident. The hesitation, before the vote, the Kethna delegate. I noticed it, I said. She opposed the decision. She was outvoted. I looked at him. I know. He nodded once and left. Nora let out a slow, quiet breath beside me. Colin was very still. 48 hours, Nora said. He'll be back in 12, I said, maybe less. She looked at me. You're sure? I looked at the doorway Veyrak had walked through, and beyond it, the long corridor, and beyond that, the 3 observation windows, and beyond those, the shipyard full of ships that had not been there 30 years ago. Yes, I said, I'm sure. The answer came in 9 hours and 40 minutes. A single transmission, formal and brief, accepting all terms without revision. I read it twice to make certain there were no embedded qualifications, the kind that council documents sometimes hid in procedural language. There were none. Veyrak had signed it personally, with secondary authorization from 4 of the 6 remaining council member delegates. 4 out of 6, Colin said when I showed him. The Sewer abstained. The Drell secondary delegate also abstained. Who authorized it? Kethna Sewer secondary, both Orth delegates, and Veyrak. I set the document down. It's enough, process it. Within the hour, the Terran sovereignty was formally at war with the Vreth and formally ceded, in an interim capacity pending the installation ceremony, on the Galactic Council. 30 years after walking out of that hall with a folder and 3 words in a journal, we had the seat. We had not needed it then. We had needed it now, because with the seat came access, and with access came the ability to coordinate what came next, and what came next was going to require more coordination than anything this part of the galaxy had seen in living memory. I called the full command briefing at 600 the following morning. Every senior officer in the Endurance, every fleet commander within communication range, every intelligence lead and logistics director and strategic analyst. The room was full in a way that felt different from ordinary briefings. There was a particular quality to the attention in it, a sharpness. The way a room feels when everyone in it knows that what is said here is going to matter for a very long time. I stood at the front, and I did not use slides or displays or data projections. I had decided the night before that this did not need to look like a presentation. It needed to look like what it was. The Vreth, I said, have spent 12 years at minimum preparing for this advance. They are not an impulsive enemy. They are patient, which means they are capable of long-term planning, which means they can be predicted and they can be countered. Every species in this galaxy that has ever made a plan has made it with assumptions. Our job is to find their assumptions and remove them. Silence in the room. Their assumption about the Council was that it would fight the way it always has. They were right about that. Their assumption about us is that we do not exist in any meaningful capacity. I looked around the room. They are wrong about that. Alice Ford, standing near the back, raised her hand. She was one of the few people I had ever met who raised her hand in a command briefing instead of simply speaking, and it was a habit I had come to find quietly endearing. Yes, Ford. Their forward formation at Wren Corridor. How many units do we estimate? Our best current figure is 90 to 110 warships at the corridor position. That's the strike group that took out Council Gamma Array. Behind them, based on intercept analysis, we believe there is a secondary formation of comparable size holding near the outer veil transition point. She did not write it down, she just absorbed it, so we're outnumbered. At Wren, with the forces currently available in immediate range, yes, which is why we are not going to fight them at Wren. The room shifted. We are going to make them come to us, I said, at a place of our choosing, at a time of our choosing, in conditions we have set. I pulled up the star chart then, the one thing I had decided to display, and I placed a marker at a point in space called the Edral Gap, a navigational choke point between two dense asteroid fields, approximately 3 days' travel from the Wren Corridor at Vreth drive speeds. The Edral Gap is the fastest route from Wren to the inner Council worlds, I said. The Vreth have been moving at predictable speeds along predictable corridors. If they continue on the path they have been on since taking the fringe worlds, they will reach Edral in 11 days. I looked at the room. We will be there in 7. What followed over the next 10 days was the most complex logistical operation the Terran sovereignty had ever run. Ships moving from 4 different staging points, supply lines running through 3 relay stations, weapons systems calibrated for a specific gravitational environment, everything coordinated through a command structure that had never operated at this scale before. I slept in 3-hour stretches, and I drank more coffee than was probably wise, and I read every report that came across my display, including the ones that were supposed to be below my level of direct attention. Because, in a situation this new and this large, the things below the level of direct attention were often the things that mattered most. Oliver Drake, now commanding the carrier group I was traveling with, found me in the ready room at 200 on the 5th day, and set a mug on my table without asking and sat down in the second chair. "You should sleep," he said. "You should also sleep," I said. I did 4 hours, it was adequate. He looked at the star chart I had open on the display. "How do you want to run the first contact?" "We do not engage first," I said. "We let them enter the gap and then we close it." He nodded slowly. He had been thinking along the same lines, I could tell. Drake was the kind of commander who thought several moves ahead and then waited to see if you had reached the same place before he shared it. "The asteroid density in the inner gap is high enough to disrupt their formation patterns," he said. "They will be forced to narrow." "Yes." "Which means they cannot use the fluid shift tactics they used at Wren." "No," I said. "At Wren they had open space. They could move. In the gap they have to commit to a line." He was quiet. Then he said, "They will not expect us to have read their doctrine this carefully." "They do not know we have been watching them for 12 years," I said. As far as they are concerned, we appeared last week. Drake almost smiled, surprise. The oldest advantage there is, I said. He picked up his own mug, which he had brought from somewhere, and held it for a moment. I have been thinking about Crossfield, about the formation I found 12 years ago and what I decided to do with it. I looked at him. You made the right call, Drake. 12 years is a long time to carry something. Yes, I said, and it bought us 12 years. Without it, we enter this conflict without what we have now. I met his eyes. You did the right thing. He nodded slowly and stood up. 7 hours until we reach the Edril marker. I know. I will have the crew ready. I know that too. He left, and I sat alone with the star chart and the mug of coffee and the particular quality of silence that exists on a ship when most people are sleeping, and the ship itself is the only thing that is fully awake. The Vreth formation entered the Edril Gap on day 11, exactly as projected. 103 warships, moving in their characteristic fluid pattern, which immediately began to compress as the asteroid density narrowed their available space. We were already there. I watched it on the main display from the command deck, standing rather than sitting, because there are moments when sitting down does not feel like the right response to what you are seeing. Nora was beside me. Colin was at the intelligence station. Alice Ford was at tactical, her voice quiet and steady as she called readings. They have detected our forward positions, she said. They are adjusting formation. Let them adjust, I said. Hold the outer line. The Vreth adjusted. They shifted their pattern, trying to open space on the starboard flank where the asteroid field was thinner. It was a sensible move. It was also exactly what we had expected. Drake's group, which had been holding dark and silent in a cluster of large asteroids on the starboard side for 9 hours, lit up their drives. On the display, it looked like the asteroid field itself had come alive. The Vreth formation fractured. For the first time, their fluid shift tactics could not save them, because the fluid they needed to shift into was occupied. Drake's ships pushed them back toward the center. Our forward line held. The secondary formation I had kept back, commanded by a precise and efficient officer named Grace Hollies, came in from the dorsal angle and cut their retreat corridor. The battle lasted 11 hours. I will not tell you it was clean or simple or without cost. We lost 19 ships, 19 crews, people I had seen in briefings and corridors and mess halls, names I knew. Oliver Drake took damage to his command ship's primary systems in the 5th hour and ran the rest of the battle from an emergency station at the back of his bridge, which was the kind of thing Drake would do and was also why I had given him that position. But the Vreth formation, the one that had destroyed 300 Council warships at Ren, was gone. Not scattered, not retreated, gone. The silence after a battle is a specific kind of silence. It has weight to it. Everyone on the command deck was still for a moment, looking at the display, looking at the space where there had been 103 enemy ships and was now debris and dissipating drive signatures. Ford said quietly, Vreth formation neutralized. No active contacts in the gap. I let that sit for a moment. Then I said, medical teams to all damaged sections. Engineering priority to drive systems. Get me a full report on the secondary formation's position. And everyone moved, because there was still work to do. But for that one moment of silence, I felt 30 years settling around me like weight being set down at last. The installation ceremony was scheduled for 15 days after the Battle of Edril Gap. I did not attend the planning meetings for it. I left that to the diplomatic team and to Nora, who had a gift for navigating ceremony that I had never fully developed. What I did attend was the debrief, the long, detailed, sometimes difficult accounting of what had happened in the gap and what it meant for what came next. The Vreth secondary formation had retreated toward the outer veil after losing contact with the primary strike group. Whether they would regroup and return was a question our intelligence teams were already working, and the answer, when it came, would shape the next chapter of a story that was not over. But for now, there was a ceremony. The Grand Hall of Concord looked the same dark stone, same floating central platform, same quality of echoing stillness when you walked in from the eastern entrance. I noticed, coming through the door, that someone had polished the floor recently. It caught light differently than I remembered. There was a new chair on the central platform, eighth in the arc. It was slightly smaller than the others, which I suspected was either a design oversight or a very deliberate reminder, and I made a note to raise it with the facilities team after the ceremony, because symbolism in furniture is not a thing to overlook. Veyrak was already on the platform. He looked at me when I came in with the Terran delegation, which included Nora and Colin and Drake and Grace Hollies, and 4 other people who had earned the right to be in that room through things that were considerably more significant than a floor pass. I walked to the speaking circle, and I stood in it for the 3rd time. The first time I had stood in it, I had been nervous, though I had not shown it. The second time I had stood in it, I had felt a cold clarity that I still sometimes use as a reference point when I need to remember what clear thinking feels like. This time I felt something quieter, not triumph, not vindication, though both of those things were present somewhere underneath. Something more like the feeling of having walked a very long road and arriving at a place you could see from the beginning. The installation protocol was read by a council secretary, a small Kethna official with careful, precise speech. I said the response phrases where they were required. I received the council seal, a physical token, disc-shaped, warm from wherever it had been stored. I held it and it was lighter than I expected. Veyrak stepped forward when the protocol concluded and extended 2 of his 4 hands. I had looked up the night before what a 2-hand extension meant in Drell formal culture. It was the greeting reserved for equals, not ceremony, not politeness, equals. I shook his hands, one of mine, 2 of his. "You kept your word," he said quietly, low enough that it was not part of the recorded ceremony. "I said we would help," I said. "We helped. You could have let us fall." "Yes," I said honestly, "we could have." He looked at me for a moment. "Why didn't you?" I thought about that. The true answer was complicated, layered, mixed with things I was not entirely proud of and things I was. I thought about Colin Price at 200 saying that people were dying out there, and that humans were not going to stop at council space. And I thought about Alice Ford asking quietly if we were going to help them. And I thought about Drake carrying 12 years of a decision on his back and calling it the right thing. "Because when it comes down to it," I said, "we don't leave people behind, even people who were wrong about us." Veyrak held my gaze for a moment. Then he nodded and stepped back to his chair. The Kethna delegate came to find me afterward, as the hall was clearing and the ceremony had dissolved into smaller conversations. She was elderly now, the one who had hesitated 30 years ago. She moved slowly, and she was accompanied by a much younger Kethna aide who stayed at a respectful distance. She stopped in front of me and looked at me with her wide, compound eyes and said, in a voice that the translator rendered softly, "I remember you, from the first time." "I remember you too," I said. "We voted against you, all of us. I could not change it." "I know," I said. "I saw you hesitate." She was quiet for a moment. "We were afraid," she said. "We saw what you were and we were afraid of what you would become." I looked at her steadily, and now. She made a sound that the translator did not render into words, but which felt, from the quality of it, like something between acknowledgement and sorrow. "Now," she said, "we know what you became." "Smart," I said quietly. She looked at me, and I saw something move behind her eyes, something like recognition, and she made the sound again, and this time the translator gave it a single word. "Yes," she said, "very." She nodded once and moved away. Her aide fell into step beside her. I stood alone in the clearing hall for a moment. Around me, the conversations continued. Nora was talking with two of the sewer delegates near the eastern entrance. Colin was reviewing something on his display with his characteristic focused expression. Drake was standing at the edge of the platform, looking up at the dome of the hall with the particular expression of an explorer seeing something for the first time. Grace Hollies had found a council tactical officer and was apparently already deep in a discussion about the outer veil monitoring strategy, because Grace Hollies did not stop working. I walked to the edge of the platform and looked out over the hall. The amber curve of Orith was visible through one of the high observation ports in the dome, the gas giant steady and slow and enormous, the same as it had always been, the same as it would be long after all of us were gone. I reached into my uniform pocket and took out the copy of the original proposal. I had carried it with me since the conference room on the Endurance. It was printed on actual paper, which was an old habit from a mentor who had told me once that paper makes things real in a way that a display cannot. I read the first line, the familiar words, the offer made by humanity 30 years ago to a galaxy that had not been ready to receive it. Then I folded it once, carefully, and put it back in my pocket. I thought about the journal entry, "Fine, we'll do it alone." And then I thought about the line I had crossed it out with, after the battle, in the quiet of the Endurance's ready room, while the ship hummed around me and the stars were visible through the porthole. We did it anyway. Both things were true, I realized. They were not contradictions. We had done it alone, and then we had chosen not to be alone, and that was not weakness or inconsistency. That was something more honest than either one by itself. A species that survives because it has to. A species that connects because it wants to. Not because it has no other choice, but because in the end, when the hall is quiet and the ceremony is done, and the stars are still there outside the window, the choice that matters is not the one someone else makes for you. It is the one you make when no one is forcing you to make it at all. Nora appeared at my shoulder. The diplomatic team wants to run through the Framework Council schedule when you're ready. Give me a minute, I said. She nodded and moved off. I stood in the Grand Hall of Concord, in the 8th chair's shadow, on the platform that had been built by 7 species over 4 centuries, and had just, quietly and permanently, become the platform of 8. I thought about a transport shuttle and a folder, and a docking attendant with 6 arms who had not looked at us. I thought about 30 years of shipyards and dark matter mapping and 3-hour sleep schedules, and the particular satisfaction of a thing done with your whole self, all the way through, without flinching. I thought about 19 crews who had not come home from the Edril Gap, and the weight of that, which did not go away and was not supposed to. I thought about the Kethna delegate who had hesitated and had been afraid and had been right and wrong at the same time, because fear sometimes comes from the right instinct pointed in the wrong direction. And then I straightened my uniform and turned away from the observation port and walked toward the rest of it. There was still a galaxy to deal with. The Vreth were not finished. The Council had decades of outdated assumptions to revise. The framework was new and untested and would require more work than the ceremony suggested. None of that frightened me, not because I was fearless, because I had learned over 30 years of building something from almost nothing that the work itself is the answer. You do not wait to be ready. You do not wait to be invited. You find what needs doing and you do it completely with every resource you have, and then you do it again. We had been told once clearly that we were not credible, that we had nothing required, that we were a Class D world playing at the edges of a larger story. We had taken that, and we had turned it into fuel, and we had burned it very slowly and very steadily for 30 years. The galaxy was still here. So were we. And from now on, we had a seat at the table. We had not needed it. We had earned it. And that made all the difference in the world.